mercy. Each week we begin our service by lighting candles. We light a candle for our friends in Cuba, and in particular Kim and Stan, as they are traveling there and will be returning home to us next week. We light a candle for Wiley Dobbs, who lives in prison in Georgia. We light a candle for all whose lives are impacted by violence in all of its forms. We light a candle for everyone whose lives continue to be impacted by COVID-19. We light a candle for our friends in Ireland, and for Brian and Gareth as they are. Brian was traveling back there this week, and Gareth will be on his way soon. And we light a candle for those who are not able to be here with us this evening, and for each of you. We're glad that you're here. Each week we gather to bear witness to the Spirit at work in our lives. We gather to remind ourselves and each other that we are not alone, that we need each other to know both God and ourselves more fully. We gather to conspire together, to literally breathe together with each other, the Spirit that surrounds us and enfolds us wherever we go. Today is Father's Day. And just as Mother's Day is complicated, so is Father's Day. And at the same time, we give thanks to all those in our lives who have served as father figures in many different ways. And we seek healing for those places where our fathers have not been who we've needed them to be. This is also June 19th, also known as Juneteenth. It's a significant date in U.S. history and for African Americans who were enslaved on this continent for way, way, way too long. And we're still tangled up in the racism around all of that. The name Juneteenth is a play on the date of June 19th. On that day in 1865, the Union Army made its way to Galveston, Texas, under the leadership of General Gordon Granger, and he announced to the people of Texas that all enslaved African Americans were free. And even though we know that the Emancipation Proclamation freed African Americans in rebelling states, Texas being one of them, from as early as when the proclamation went into effect in January of 1963. And we know that the Civil War had ended in April of 1865. It took a while for freedom to make its way to the westernmost state. Although there were enslavers who were aware of the implementation of the Emancipation Proclamation, it wasn't until June 19, 1865, that it was actually enforced. June 19th freed enslaved people in those remaining states, but it did not free enslaved people throughout the nation. Nancy is going to come and offer a word of context about folks who will be leading in worship this evening. So I'll invite Nancy up.
So once again, my friends, it is the best and worst of times. Once again in our country, we are experiencing this time of reckoning in so many ways. And we hope it is a time of reckoning and awakening to transformation from the tragedy of racism. James Baldwin said, "White people are trapped in a history they don't understand." To get untrapped, we look at our legacy of white supremacy, white systems and structures that perpetuate racial injustice. White people have our own work to do to become clear-eyed. We've been seeking to do that in so many ways in this community. And one way is a small group, small is imperative, small group that took a journey through a 7-week course a year ago called What Does It Mean to Be White? The curriculum was developed by Reverend Dr. Ben Boswell, who's a pastor of Myers Park Baptist Church in Charlotte. Mahan and I became facilitators for the course after we had had our own experience in the course led by Ben. So the small group in our circle gathered, and we took a deep dive into the material that was weekly movies and writings by Black authors and creatives. We kept a journal. We wrote a racial autobiography. We prayed, we meditated, and we discussed together. It was a deeply honest and soul-searching work that is a journey of reckoning and awakening. So several in that group will be speaking in this service tonight, informed through that experience. James Baldwin said, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." So we face the truth with the hope that a transformative change to justice comes. Let us be together, taking a deep breath, and be in silence, breathing in the Spirit together. I invite you to stand with me for our call to worship. Come into this place where God listens.
Where you need no money, no status, no fine clothes.
Come as you are.
Broken, whole,
Sick, well.
satisfied, or with deep needs.
Come to sing.
Come proud.
Come to hear.
Come to see.
Come and be ready.
Come be made ready.
We are here.
God is here too.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise the
Come on now. Well, today I am going to tell you a story about Juneteenth and why we have this special holiday. Today is June 19, right? So Juneteenth is a mashup of those two words, Juneteenth. And it happened a long time ago, before you were born, before your parents were born, before even your grandparents were born, in a place called Texas. Anybody know somebody from Texas? I can think of somebody. Pastor Nancy's from Texas. So on June 19, a long time ago, in 1865, a bunch of soldiers came to give some news that was actually kind of old. It was more than 2.5 years old. 2.5 years before, President Abraham Lincoln, who I think is here for a visit today.
Oh, yes.
President Lincoln had signed an order that we call the Emancipation Proclamation.
Yep.
A very important document. Emancipation means to be free. And proclamation is really just a fancy way of saying an official announcement. So it was an official announcement saying that everybody in the United States who was enslaved, slaves were people who were forced to work places they didn't want to and be without their families, and they didn't have any right to choose what they wanted to do and were often treated very, very meanly. It was a really unfair thing, and we had a big war about it. And in the middle of that war, called the Civil War, President Lincoln signed this document. All slaves are free, forever. But guess what? Back then, this is kind of what the United States looked like. We had all these northern states. They're the ones fighting to free slaves. We had all these southern states, the Confederate states. And guess where North Carolina was? Even though it's called North Carolina, we were in the Confederate states fighting to keep people slaves. And then way over here was Texas. Texas likes to think of itself as its own country, and it kind of was then. So it took more than 2.5 years and the end of that war, which the northern states won, for the people in Texas to get the news. So one day on June 19, a bunch of soldiers came in. They were very, very official looking.
Oh.
They looked scary. And they said, "Hey, we have some important news. This important document was signed. And in fact, we won this war. You are free." So 250,000 or more people who had been enslaved suddenly realized that they were free. And that was the start of this celebration. And the very next year, they had the first Juneteenth celebration, and there was all kinds of good food and all kinds of good music and a celebration of freedom. The right to make your own choice about where you want to live and where you want to work and if you can see your family and important things like that. And this was celebrated in Texas for quite a while. And then it was celebrated in the larger Black community for a long time. And gradually more and more people started to learn about this, which is really our second Independence Day. Because we had an Independence Day, but when we said people were free on July 4th, we didn't really mean it back then. So Juneteenth reminds us that we're not free until everybody is free. And it also helps us remember to keep hope, because there were people who worked for this freedom for many, many years before it actually happened. So I like to celebrate Juneteenth to remember hope and that we're not all free until everybody is free. So that's the story of Juneteenth. Thank you, helpers.
There is more love somewhere. There is more love somewhere. We're gonna keep on till we find it. There is more love somewhere. There is more hope somewhere. mercy somewhere. There is mercy somewhere. We're gonna keep on till we find it. There is mercy somewhere.
Prayer time. Are there any joys or concerns that you would like to share? My participation in the class, he described my personal confronting whiteness, it just changed my life. And it's just that simple. The scales fell from my eyes. I admitted the truth that whiteness is not this so much, but empire and dominance. Janet DeWart Bell, an early contributor to Ms. magazine, published 50 years ago, said, "People who don't understand their history don't understand they have a future." So I want to very briefly confess my personal racial history to you. Part of my family's generational wealth came from my ancestors in Goldsboro, North Carolina, who owned people for profit until the end of the Civil War. My family's lore called these folks planters, but they were enslavers. My ancestors who didn't own people benefited from an economic and political system that was unsustainable without the free labor of slaves and later the abuse of fellow citizens. I was always proud as a child, especially, to be named for Rebecca Hayes, who worked for my mother's alcoholic parents and practically raised my mother and her sisters. Rebecca was much beloved, but her weekday housing at my grandparents' was a glorified tool shed, and her toilet and sink were off the basement garage of the house. For at least the first 10 years of my life, Rebecca Hayes could not vote in North Carolina, among many other things. And I'm not aware of anybody in my family, including me, who advocated for her rights at all. I could go on, but perhaps you also understand your history. I basically refuse an assurance of pardon for this confession, but I do pray for a second chance at a new future where we listen and learn, become more kind, and are changed and do better. Parts of the prayer I'm going to read in just a minute come from my friend Carol Majors, who wrote it as God of a Second Chance, and from the Disciples of Christ, the Christian Church. Please join me in prayer. Creator God, you roll into our lives like quiet thunder, with a strength and a force to bring winds of change, the cleansing rain of grief, and the dazzling flashes of enlightenment. We know that reaping benefits from unjust behavior too often seems normal to us. With opened eyes, we publicly acknowledge we stand on the backs of countless humans, often not even thinking how this came to be. To transform ourselves and change the world, we have much internal work to do. We are made uneasy by that task, but we know if we close our eyes in fear, in rage, in guilt, in frustration or distrust, we will miss the glorious ways you reveal to us. For our human family, including the likes of James Baldwin and Fannie Lou Hamer, who did not know us, but still today speak to our hearts, we give thanks. For the memory of folks like Rebecca Hayes that propels us down the road, shining light ahead for our work, we give thanks. For you, God, who has been with us all along, repeatedly nudging us towards right thinking and right behavior, we give thanks. Journey with us now as we become true followers of Jesus, who are called to erase the lines that Jesus did not draw.
There is mercy somewhere. There is mercy somewhere. We're gonna keep on till we find it. There is mercy somewhere. There is more hope somewhere. There is more hope somewhere. We're gonna keep on till we find it. There is more hope somewhere. There is more love somewhere. There is more love somewhere. We're gonna keep on till we find it. There is more love somewhere.
Passage for this evening from the book of Ephesians, chapter 6. Finally, be strong in God and in the strength of God's power. Put on the whole armor of God so that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For our struggle is not against enemies of blood and flesh, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers of this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, so that you may be able to withstand on that day, and having done everything, to stand firm. Stand therefore, and fasten the belt of truth around your waist, and put on the breastplate of righteousness. As shoes for your feet, put on whatever will make you ready to proclaim the gospel of peace. Walk with all of these. Take the shield of faith, with which you will be able to quench all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. Pray in the Spirit of all times, in every prayer and supplication. To that end, keep alert and always persevere in supplication for all the saints. A word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
My name is Doug. I'm a white male. I've been told that to name and accept your addiction is the first step to recovery. Until recently, I did not even realize that there was an addiction to being male, white, and privileged. In May of 2021, I willingly accepted an invitation to embark on a spiritual journey into the heart of whiteness, led by Marian and Nancy. Nancy told us up front that this would entail self-examination and working our salvation out with fear and trembling. Even with this dire warning, I was unconcerned, for after all, Circle of Mercy is associated with a Baptist organization. So it seemed a little wailing and gnashing of teeth was on par. Little did I know. Before our first meeting, we were requested to write a racial autobiography, a sort of a catalog of development of our individual racial identity. As an exercise, it awakened many memories of stories that had influenced who I had become. A major part of our preparation were readings. We read and discussed titles such as The Souls of White Folks by W.E.B. Du Bois, God's Judgment on White America by Malcolm X, On Being White and Other Lies by James Baldwin, and my favorite, What Does Jesus Have to Do with Whiteness by Kelly Brown Douglas. Over and over again, I heard voices that painted a picture of terribly broken world filled with horror and pain. The material was at times overwhelming. And condemning.
Well,
Why had I not listened to those voices before? I went back to my racial autobiography and found myself a clueless young man. So I want to tell you 3 stories and how my self-examination has changed my perception of my racial autobiographical journey. In 1971, the English department of my upstate New York high school decided that we should read a play by James Baldwin entitled The Blues for Mr. Charlie. This play is loosely based on the murder of Emmett Till and was dedicated to the memory of Medgar Evers, his widow and children, and the dead children of Birmingham, Alabama. There was an immediate outcry in our community that such a play was to be read in our high school. It was all about the obscene language. But I'm doubting at this point that language was the real issue. If that were the case, they would have just closed the locker rooms before and after athletic events. Besides, in Canandaigua, New York, we had no racial problems. The one black family in town seemed to get by just fine.
yeah.
And besides, as we all know, this was a Southern problem. In 1975, I was a counselor for an Upward Bound program at Oregon State University. Disadvantaged students were brought to the university from all corners of Oregon for an on-campus summer program for the summer school in hopes that they would catch up academically and with their peers socially. I lived in the dorm with the students, and I was assigned about 15 high school boys. A good number of my students were black students from inner city Portland. One night, after curfew, I caught a few of these guys sneaking out of the dorm. And in an attempt to keep them from leaving, I grabbed one by the shoulder. He quickly turned, and with a menace and hatred I had not seen before or since, he took my hand from his shoulder and said, "Don't you dare touch me again." He gave me a few minutes to respond, which I did not. And then he slowly turned and went out the door. I had never understood until now where that kind of hatred and anger came from. So what to do? Well, obviously this self-examination left me horrified that most of my life I've been clueless and out to a privileged lunch. Nancy understated the warning. Perhaps she should have warned us of horror and trembling. All seemed lost. And then Greg Yost came a-preaching. On a Sunday when Missy and Kim, they began our service with a litany of mass murders. Greg lifted us up out of the depths and reminded us, little is much. That little moments of God's love and grace add up and are important and even necessary. As many of you know, I design and make theatrical masks. Not long ago, I was talking to a friend who's from Puerto Rico, who teaches at the theater at the UNC Charlotte. He shared with me that he and his colleagues of color were frustrated about a particular theater mask that was used in acting training. It's called the neutral mask. He said it was so Eurocentric, not at all representative of him or many of the students in his classes. Not long after that, I had a conversation. I was asked by Furman University to design and make 12 neutral masks for use in their acting classes. Well, I related the conversation to the theater department chair, and I offered to redesign the masks, the classic standard neutral masks, into a non-expressive, ethnic-free mask that could be painted in many different skin tone colors. She liked the idea. She approved my design. Little things. Can they really make a difference? And Greg Yost says, yes.
Well,
We are going, heaven knows where we are going. We know within, and we will get there. Heaven knows how we will get there. We know we will. It will be hard, we know, and the road will be muddy and rough, but we'll get there. Heaven knows how we will get there. We know we will. Woyaya, 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 woyaya.
Good afternoon, everybody.
good afternoon.
The author and activist James Baldwin counsels his nephew to love their oppressors in order to win them over. Love your oppressors. 2,000 years ago, Jesus taught and demonstrated such radical love, which brings us here. These are a few excerpts taken from Baldwin's letter to his nephew. I have begun this letter 5 times and torn it up 5 times. This is not an easy subject. Know whence you came. And if you know whence you came, there is really no limit to where you can go. And he goes on, the really terrible thing, old buddy, speaking to his nephew, is that you must accept them, white people. And I mean that very seriously. You must accept them and accept them with love. For these innocent people have no other hope. They are, in effect, still trapped in a history which they do not understand, and until they understand it, they cannot be released from it. And continuing on, he says, and if the word integration means anything, this is what it means, that we, with love, shall force our brothers to see themselves as they are, to cease fleeing from reality and begin to change it. We cannot be free until they are free. That seems to be a theme today. 3 years ago, Carrie's and my son Benjamin took us to the planetarium in Chapel Hill. I was mesmerized by the thousands, if not millions, of stars that dotted that skyline. And a few months later, when walking on the Camino to Santiago, I visited dozens of cathedrals that were built to inspire with their towering Gothic architecture. And while I was impressed, each time I recalled all those stars I had seen just a few months earlier, and how the most impressive Gothic architecture paled in comparison to God's creation. These great churches, much of religion, many of our social systems, and issues such as racism are created by us people because we fear change and we cannot take in the immensity and mystery of God. I didn't always see God's DNA imprinted on creation. My coming of awareness story is probably fairly typical to many white people. I grew up in the largest black majority county in the country. I attended Frederick Douglass High School, which a handful of years earlier had been the black high school in my area. The valedictorian, half my teammates, and many of my friends were black. And then after college, Carrie and I spent 12 years working and living in Africa with Habitat for Humanity. I share all this because even with this incredible exposure to people of color, I still didn't get it.
Well,
I was cocooned in a family of love, but as James Baldwin writes, I was naive or innocent to the racial justice realities raging around me. I didn't see below the surface, didn't know what black people dealt with day in and day out, and the challenges and the injustices. Thus, when I look back, I wonder how deep any of my relationships really were with my black friends. And I realized they had a great deal of grace and patience with me. Since moving to Asheville, I've gone through various programs focused on systemic racism, including a program by the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation and Building Bridges and the Racial Equity Institute, and now the Whiteness program with Nancy and Mayhem. My understanding of and the lens with which I look at racism has evolved. And so has my faith. Spiritually, our closeness to God is dependent on how we view the world and how we view other people. We are part of something big, real big. And until we see ourselves inextricably intertwined with the fate of all our brothers and sisters, and their fate linked to ours, we are not seeing God fully. And again, how liberating is this? So, and what does it mean to be white? The course is taught through the eyes and words of black authors and theologians. You learn about the ideology of whiteness. Layla Saad says, we cannot dismantle what we cannot see. And for so many years, I did not see. And I still don't see a lot, I know that. And we cannot challenge what we don't understand. Therefore, as white people, learning to see and understanding the history and reality of whiteness is where our journey of becoming anti-racist begins. The Whiteness course with Mahan and Nancy is a mirror. It's a liminal space where you can just be and examine your motivations. And I think we all did that in our group. And I'm grateful for them creating that space. And I'm really grateful for my fellow amazing sojourners.
We are going, heaven knows where we are going. We know within, and we will get there. Heaven knows how we will get there.
As a child growing up in the South in the 50s and the 60s, segregation and the racism in which it's rooted were part of the very fabric of my life. The women who worked in my home, helping my mother corral her 7 children, were always black. The closest school to my home, whose marching band practices I could hear in my front yard, was not the school I would attend. Only black children went there. And I certainly never saw a person of color in worship at First Baptist Church. The thing is, I did not know there was anything wrong with that situation. I didn't understand that this separation was rooted in hate. I honestly wasn't aware that anybody was being hurt by it. I guess I was that thoroughly insulated and protected from reality. What's your first memory of being aware of racial injustice? Can you name it? Mine came one Sunday afternoon at a Tasty Freeze. Doug will tell you that I am a reader of signs. I mean, like the kind of signs that you see along the side of the road, or on buildings, or on billboards. That Sunday afternoon, as we pulled up at the ice cream shop, I noticed a sign on the window that hadn't been there the previous week. Now, I was one of the children charged with taking orders and going to get cones of ice cream for the family. Just as my siblings were calling out whether they wanted chocolate or vanilla, I read the sign. And I turned to my brother, who had ordered a chocolate ice cream cone, to let him know that they didn't have chocolate that day, because the sign on the window read, "We serve white only." Growing up swimming in racism, I didn't even know what that sign meant. So innocent, and yet so complicit. How insidious can be our ignorance. Experiences like our Confronting Whiteness group, they serve to remind me of those racist roots that run so deeply in my Southern soul. But they also called me to continue on the road of healing and the road of working for justice. Similarly, at this table, each week we are reminded of who we are as a community of faith. And we pledge anew our commitment to the journey we are on as Christ followers. Jesus broke bread, and he shared it with his friends. He poured wine, and he shared it with them as well. His body, his blood, giving us life. Eat, drink, and remember.
from this place knowing that you are beloved children of God. Go encouraged and strengthened, knowing that there is much work for us to do in this world. But also go knowing that you don't do that work alone, that we accompany each other in the work toward a world where all can live in peace and unafraid. Go in peace.
Guide my feet while I run